Game Arts is famous today for developing such franchises as Lunar and Grandia. But how did they get started? Today, we're going to take a look at the first decade of this company and the games it released, as well as a little bit about the two brothers at the heart of Game Arts. When Yoichi Miyagi was in junior high school, he found himself fascinated by the game Space Invaders. However, being a child, 100 yen per play was too expensive for him. Working on the information from his friends that there were free games in computer stores in Akihabara, he started biking over there, about 45 kilometers or roughly 30 miles away. He began to make friends and learn about programming while hanging out at the stores, and was eventually asked by one of the managers to make a racing game for them to be sold out of the store. After that, he began to work in the area part-time. While in high school, he had the stroke of luck of being employed in a store in Akihabara where the manager was about to join the company ASCII. Yoichi was introduced by the manager to one of the founders of ASCII, Keiichiro Tsukamoto, and would join the company while still a high school student. He began working for ASCII on a game type-in book called Tape ASCII, and also had some planning involvement with their AX and SX compilation releases, to which his brother Takeshi contributed 2 games, Space Enemy on AX6, a vertical space shooter, and Doitsu Africa Soko Gundam, a World War II strategy game, for the SX2 collection. Yoichi would eventually go on to law school, but dropped out shortly afterwards. He wanted to move up in the ranks at ASCII, but was told jokingly by a colleague that he was too hard to deal with, and advised to start his own company. He took this advice to heart, despite it being a bit of a joke, read the articles of incorporation on his own, and applied over 20 times to set up shop in Setai Award in Tokyo. Eventually, this would be successful, and in 1985, at the age of 21, Yoichi was able to form the company Game Arts with his brother Takeshi. Game Arts was structured like this. Takeshi would take more of a hand in technical matters, and Yoichi would be more involved with the business side of things. According to the brothers in various interviews, Game Arts had 2 goals. The first was to prove games as art, and the second was to push the technical ability of contemporary computers as much as they could. Together with a handful of their friends, and working out of an extremely tiny apartment, the company began work on its first game, Thexter. 2 of the friends mentioned were Hibiki Godai and Satoshi Usaka. Godai and Usaka were interested in creating a game that might appeal to kids, but also have high-speed scrolling, a feature not previously available on the NEC PC-88. To create unusually smooth animation, the title character in Thexter has 48 animation patterns. That, combined with 72 different enemies in the game, each individually animated, led to hundreds of animations. Thexter ended up being a large success for the company, with some notable ports to other systems. The Famicom port would be done by Squaresoft, and the ports for Western PCs would be handled by Sierra. Thexter could best be described as a mecha maze game, where you must navigate a transforming robot across a series of levels. In robot form, it can home with a laser. In ship form, it has much greater range of movement, but it can only fire in a straight line. Additionally, there is a shield that the robot can use to mitigate damage, but it wipes out quickly and after a certain point cannot be used. It's extremely difficult and extremely addicting. Thexter would be successful on both sides of the world, spawning a sequel that we'll look at a little later on, and even a US-only sequel for Windows 95 that didn't have the involvement of the original team. Also released around the same time as Thexter was QB Panic. QB Panic is a simple puzzle game where this little creature in a top hat must grab keys from cubes and use them to escape, all while avoiding being crushed. It's not as groundbreaking as Thexter, but it's a cute little puzzle game. Building on his previous space shooter idea from the AX series, Takeshi Miyagi went on to create their next release, Sylphid. Sylphid is a top-down shooter that uses 3D polygonal graphics and is generally ahead of its time, using features such as full speech. It's impossible to talk about Sylphid without talking about the excellent music. Hibiki Godai would compose the first two stages, with the rest of the soundtrack split between Masakuni Mitsuhashi, writing as Hiromi Oba, and the duo of Fumito Kasakani and Nobuyuki Aoshima, formerly of the band Modernista. Kasakani and Oshima would go on to form a separate company outside of Game Arts, Makano Associates, and would be involved with the vast majority of the rest of Game Arts' catalog. The game has three types of levels. The first is a vertically scrolling space shooter similar to Galaga. The second has a background of an approaching planet that you dip into the atmosphere and out of as you get to the end of the level. And the third one is a kind of storming the base level. It would prove to be a great hit for Game Arts, and Sierra would once again port it to multiple PC platforms in the West. Sylphid would get an updated port in 1993 for the Sega CD. This port would use pre-rendered video backgrounds, as well as have an expanded story, with cutscenes between levels telling the tale of a fleet moving against space pirates that have hijacked Earth's computer networks. It's expanded gameplay a little bit in terms of having more variation in the levels, but with the pre-rendered video backgrounds, it's a little hard to tell what's an object that's going to be harming you and what's just part of the general fireworks. Still, it remains addictive, and the soundtrack, of course, remains incredible. Next up, we have the role-playing game Zeliard, where the character Duke Garland must find the 9 Tears of Esmasanti and defeat Jashin, the Lord of Chaos. Zeliard has a memorable opening, with Jashin coming out of the screen and taunting the player, that would later be imitated in the game Ultima 7. Zeliard is split between maze-like side-scrolling dungeons and towns where you can rest, buy weapons and magic, level up, and save your game. There are some wrinkles, however. Enemies drop resources you can convert into gold, and you can store that gold in a bank, since every time you die, you lose all of your gold in the Japanese version and half of your gold in the Western conversion for DOS. You have to also check with the local sage to see if you have enough experience to level up, and that is the only way to level. They'll give you hints if you're close, but that's all you can do. Lastly, while you can buy shields, they are consumable objects and will break over time. Zeliard continues the Game Arts tradition of being tough as nails while also addictive, much like the previous games on the list. After Zeliard, Game Arts would release Veguez, Tactical Gladiator, for the PC-88, and later the TurboGrafx 16 or PC Engine, depending on where you're from. Veguez takes a lot of inspiration from Thexter and Sylphid. One life, no continues. It's a side-scrolling action game where you play as a mecha who has the sole chance against a long-standing alien occupation. The controls are kind of strange. Pressing down shifts the mecha going from left to right, and controlling the gun and making it fire downwards at an angle feels clunky and awkward. The game has some nice visuals, including about 5 layers of scrolling backgrounds behind the main character, but it doesn't feel as smooth as Sylphid or Thexter. It's not bad by any means, but it just doesn't feel up to the same standard as the previous games. Thexter 2 Firehawk would be released next, and has some improvements over its predecessor. There's a story now, with some rather lavish animated cutscenes at the beginning and end of the game, as well as a more fair difficulty level. There are power-ups giving a greater variety of weapons, and a much smoother feel overall to the game. Further along the line, Faria, a Famicom game, is another RPG release, and it's a rather grindy top-down game with a female protagonist, some more surreal humor, and some very tricky dungeons with looped patterns and false walls. An unusual game released by Game Arts from this time is Harakiri. Harakiri is a strategy game with humorous elements designed by Takeshi again. The concept of the game is that it is a historical strategy game designed by an American who doesn't know anything about actual Japanese history. So due to this, historical figures are replaced by caricatures of actors, units are not historically correct and involve things like sumo wrestlers, and other bizarre elements show up like turn-based ninja battles. The daimyo under you have a shame meter, and if the shame meter gets too high, then you order them to execute themselves. Despite this somewhat sarcastic take on Nobunaga's ambition, it would later be reworked as the strategy game Tenkafubu, with its parody elements removed, and both brothers would continually cite it in interviews as one of their favorites. Working with another Japanese developer contracted to them, Yellow Horn, and going all the way from 1987 to a recent release in 2016 for PSN, Game Arts would also develop a series of mahjong games for computers and consoles based on the gag manga Gambler Jiko Chushinha. The series play more or less the same, with the exception of a puzzle variation released for the PC-88, and are notable for their innovations in AI, where Yoichi Miyagi sought out to have unique playstyles for the characters based on their personalities. They're all playing mahjong in a different way, and they're all playing it wrong. Game Arts would also work on several ports. These include Jano Toryumon, a more serious mahjong game than the ones we just looked at, a port of the Spectrum Holobyte game Solitaire Royale, as well as several different releases in the Famista Baseball series of games, known in the United States as RBI Baseball. Hibiki Gadai would port these games to the PC-88 VA, a home computer release with a more powerful sound card than the generic PC-88, and the FM Towns. Finally, let's take a look at Alicia Dragoon for the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive. Alicia Dragoon is a side-scrolling action game with a lot of Thexter's DNA in it. Alicia's main attack is a lightning storm that works very similar to Thexter's homing laser. New to the mix are 4 helper monsters that Alicia can switch on the fly that can also be upgraded as you progress through the levels. Interestingly, Alicia Dragoon was co-produced by the animation company Gainax, famous for Neon Genesis Evangelion and many other films and shows. The Gainax staff member who was one of the designers of the game, Yoshimi Kanda, originally wanted to collaborate on Thexter 2, but instead decided to combine the elements of Firehawk with other RPG-like elements. The characters were designed by former illustrator Hajime Sato, who continues to work in gaming as an illustrator to this day. The last game he worked on was Catherine Fullbody. Alicia Dragoon is a return to form after Veguez. It plays much smoother and controls very well, despite the large amount of enemies on screen at times. The music is memorable, and it maintains that addictive high difficulty quality. The next releases by Game Arts would change the company into something more familiar to what we know today. Partnering with the novelist Kei Shigema, Yoichi Miyagi would try to develop gaming further, hearing out and developing on Shigema's ideas that most contemporary games had stories but didn't really have good storytelling. This would give birth to the Lunar Series. Takeshi's contribution to the RPG genre would come a little bit later on. Takeshi wanted an RPG where the characters had more personality, and where characters interacted more naturally with each other than the tailored-to-the-player hero dialogue presented in most RPGs. That idea would give rise to Grandia. See you next time.